My name is Leah Greer. I'm 34. And 3 weeks ago, I traced a six-figure fraud back to a $14 filing fee nobody thought to hide well enough. The living room smelled like pine sap and burnt sugar cookies, string lights throwing red and gold across 40 photographs of grandchildren who weren't mine, pinned to a corkboard my mother had clearly spent hours on. The fireplace crackled in the corner, more for ambiance than actual heat, and somewhere in the kitchen, my mother's old radio was playing the same instrumental Christmas station. She's played every year since I was a child, the same 6 songs, looping in a way that used to feel comforting and now just felt like background noise to something I'd already stopped being able to enjoy. The house itself hadn't changed in the decades since I'd moved out. The same beige carpet worn thin in a path from the kitchen to the living room, the same china cabinet in the corner holding plates nobody had used in years. The same smell of my mother's potpourri sitting in a dish by the front door that greeted you before anything else did. I'd grown up in these rooms. I knew exactly which floorboard creaked outside my old bedroom, exactly which kitchen cabinet stuck if you didn't lift it slightly while pulling. There was a strange ache in that kind of familiarity tonight, the comfort of a house that knew me, paired with the discomfort of a family that had decided, slowly and without ever announcing it, that my daughters didn't quite belong inside it the same way I once had. Emma's hand was wrapped around 2 fingers of mine, sweaty despite the chill coming off the window behind us. Cora stood half a step behind her sister, the way she always did at my parents' house, like the room itself required her to take up less space. She had her good dress on, the green one with the little embroidered snowflakes that she'd insisted on wearing, even though it was a size too small now, because she remembered somehow that it was the dress she'd worn the one Christmas 2 years ago, when there had still been a small chance her name might get called. Dean stood at my shoulder, not saying anything, which was its own kind of saying something. He'd learned years ago that the quietest thing he could do for me in this house was simply be there, solid, watching. I felt the warmth of him at my side, steady the way he always is, and I was grateful for it in the specific way you're grateful for a fixed point when everything else in a room keeps shifting under you. My mother stood up first. She always did. Diane Hale held a single sheet of paper the way other people hold scripture. Both hands, slight reverence, the kind of weight that told you she'd rehearsed this. 63 years old, reading glasses pushed up into hair she'd had set that morning, because Diane Hale does not let Christmas catch her looking anything less than composed. She wore the deep red blouse she wears every year for this exact moment, the one she calls her Christmas Eve blouse, as if the holiday itself required a specific uniform for the act of reading names off a list. Her rings caught the light from the tree every time she adjusted the paper in her hands, the small clinking sound of jewelry against jewelry, somehow louder than it should have been in a room, otherwise gone quiet for her. She'd done this every year for as long as I could remember, though it hadn't always felt like a performance. When I was young, the list had simply been a list. Every grandchild's name read aloud, no exclusions, no calculation behind which names made the page. It had become something else gradually. Over the years, the way most cruelty in families becomes normalized, not through a single decision, but through a slow accumulation of smaller ones, each easy enough to excuse on its own. I felt Emma's fingers tighten around mine before my mother had even started reading. "The list," she said, "of grandchildren who deserve gifts this year. Aiden." Applause. My sister Beth's son, 9 years old, beaming like he'd won something. He'd won it in October, when Beth posted about needing a little help this year. And my parents had quietly, generously, responsibly stepped in. Olivia. More applause. My sister Beth's daughter, twin to Aiden, already halfway to the tree, where the gifts under it were stacked, the way department store displays are stacked, height sorted, ribbon matched, gold foil paper catching the light from the string lights overhead. My father, Roy, clapped along from the recliner. 66 years old, and he has perfected the art of being present without ever being there. He didn't look at me. He never looks at me during this part. He had a mug of something warm balanced on the armrest, the steam curling up past his face, and his eyes stayed fixed somewhere just past my shoulder the entire time my mother read. He's never once, in 3 years, said a single word during this part of the evening, not in support of my mother, not against her, just silence. The specific kind of silence that takes more effort to maintain than people realize. The silence of a man who has decided comfort is worth more than confrontation and has built an entire personality around proving it. I used to think his silence meant he disagreed quietly, that somewhere behind that mug of cider he was uncomfortable too. I'd stopped believing that somewhere around the second Christmas this happened. Silence that long, that consistent, isn't discomfort. It's a choice, repeated often enough to become a character trait. My mother folded the paper. She didn't read 2 more names. She didn't read them last year either. Or the year before that. Maybe next year, she'd told me once, 2 Christmases ago, when I'd asked calmly, if they behave. Emma is 8. She has never, in her entire life, behaved in any way that would explain this. She is gentle and quiet, and she still draws pictures of Grandma's house with crayons, even though the last 3 Christmases have not given her much material worth drawing. I'd found one in her backpack that morning, actually, folded into quarters. A crayon drawing of this exact living room, the tree, 6 stick figures standing under it, every one of them smiling, none of it matching what was about to happen in the next 60 seconds. Cora is 5. She doesn't fully understand yet why her name never gets read. She just knows it doesn't, and she started watching her sister's face for the cue on how to feel about that. I felt the room the way I feel a ledger that doesn't balance. Something underneath the visible numbers was wrong, and it had been wrong for a long time, and everyone in the room had simply agreed not to look at it directly. I am a forensic accountant. I find the places where a story and the math stop matching. I had spent 14 years building a career out of the specific, unglamorous skill of not looking away from a discrepancy just because everyone around me wanted to. 2 months earlier, a discrepancy had found me first. A soft credit inquiry, routine, the kind you run when you're refinancing, the kind I run on myself twice a year out of habit, had returned a number that didn't belong to me. A revolving account. $148,000. Opened 18 months prior. Opened in my name. I didn't gasp. I didn't call anyone yet. I did what I always do when a number doesn't match the world it's supposed to describe. I started pulling records, statements, disbursement dates, origination documents. I built a timeline the way I'd build one for any client, except every entry had my name at the top, and none of the spending had my signature on it. Standing in my parents' living room, watching my mother fold that piece of paper back into her cardigan pocket like she'd just handled something mildly distasteful. I wasn't thinking about the list anymore. I was thinking about $62,000 that had moved into an account tied to my sister's rent. If you've ever stood in a room full of relatives and felt like the only person doing math while everyone else just kept clapping, drop a comment. I think that particular loneliness is more common than people admit, especially this time of year. I was thinking about $34,000 that lined up almost to the dollar, with 18 months of private tuition invoices for 2 children currently unwrapping gifts 6 feet away from my daughters. I was thinking about the exact dollar amount still sitting, untouched, in a folder on my laptop, labeled with nothing more dramatic than a date. My mother clapped her hands together once, the signal that gift time had officially begun, and Aiden tore into a box twice the size of anything that had ever sat under this tree with Emma's or Cora's name on it. The wrapping paper came off in long, dramatic strips, scattering across the carpet, and Beth laughed from the couch, delighted, phone already raised to record her son's reaction for whatever platform she'd post it to later. "Mom?" Emma whispered. Not really a question, just checking the shape of the wound to see if it still fit the same way it had last year. "Are we not yet, baby?" I said, and I meant it in a way she couldn't have understood. Not maybe next year. Not yet. I'd been doing arithmetic for 2 months. Tracking dates, cross-referencing disbursements, building a case file the way I build every case file. Patiently, completely, without telling the subject of the investigation that the investigation exists. I'd spent late nights at my kitchen table doing exactly the kind of work I do for strangers' companies, except every line item this time belonged to people who'd held me as a baby, who'd taught me to drive, who'd sat across from me at 1,000 dinners, pretending the math always added up. This year, the math had finally closed. I let go of Emma's hand, just for a second, and reached for my bag, sitting at my feet by the edge of the couch, where I'd left it deliberately within reach. There was a small red box inside it. It didn't have a bow. I'd wrapped nothing decorative around it on purpose. No ribbon, no festive paper, nothing that would let anyone mistake what was inside for a gift before they'd already committed to opening it. Dean caught my eye. He didn't ask what I was about to do. He'd known for 2 weeks, ever since I'd shown him the 12 pages, and he'd asked me exactly one question that night. "Are you sure?" And then never asked it again, because he already knew the answer the way he knows most things about me, by watching how still I get right before I act. I was very still right now. My mother turned back toward the tree, scanning for the next gift to hand out, already moving past the moment like she always did, like exclusion was a weather pattern. Unfortunate, but no one's particular fault. Her hand hovered over a box wrapped in silver paper, checking the tag, already reading the next name on a list none of the rest of us had been given a copy of. I stood up. The couch cushion shifted beneath me, the small sound of fabric settling, drawing nobody's attention but my own. Across the room, my father's eyes flicked toward me for half a second, the first time all evening, and then away again, back to the safety of his mug, the steam, the recliner he's occupied every Christmas Eve of my entire life, like it's load-bearing for the whole event. No one in the room had any idea that the quietest person at the party was holding the only piece of paper that actually mattered. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because I think it matters for anyone watching who's ever stood exactly where I was standing. The hardest part of this whole night wasn't the math. The math had never once been the hard part. I've balanced more complicated numbers before breakfast than the ones sitting in that folder. The hard part was watching my daughters, 8 and 5 years old, dressed in their good clothes, hopeful in the specific, renewable way children stay hopeful even after years of evidence telling them not to be. Stand in a room that had quietly decided, year after year, that they weren't worth a name on a list. I'd spent 14 years learning to separate feeling from function, to do the work first and let the emotion catch up to me later, on my own time, in a kitchen at midnight where nobody could see it cost me anything. That skill had built my entire career. Tonight, for the first time, I understood it had also been keeping me in this living room for 3 Christmases longer than I should have stayed quiet. I thought, standing there, about every version of this evening I'd imagined over the last 2 months while I built the case file in secret. Every variation of what I might say, how loudly, how calmly, whether I'd cry or stay perfectly composed the entire time. None of those imagined versions had quite captured what it would actually feel like, standing in my childhood living room with my daughter's small hands, once in mine, and a folder of fraud documentation in my bag, 4 feet away, watching my mother reach for the next gift like nothing in the room had changed at all. It had changed. It had been changing for 2 months, quietly in spreadsheets and bank statements and late-night phone calls to fraud departments, long before anyone else in this house had any idea the ground beneath their version of the story had already shifted. My mother's hand closed around the silver-wrapped box. She turned, smiling, already opening her mouth to read the next name. I crossed the room before she could. The carpet felt the same under my shoes as it always had. Worn thin in the same path I'd walked 1,000 times as a child, toward a tree that had never once, in 3 years, held a gift with either of my daughters' names on it. I felt Dean's eyes on my back, steady, not stopping me, just watching the way he always watches, ready to step forward the second I needed him to, and otherwise giving me exactly the room I needed to do this myself. Behind me, I heard Emma whisper something to Cora, too quiet to make out, the kind of small sisterly reassurance that shouldn't have to exist in a room full of grandparents who were supposed to be providing it themselves. I reached the tree just as my mother turned back toward the room, paper still in her other hand, and for 1/2 second before anything else happened, I watched her face hold its practiced Christmas Eve composure completely intact. The same expression she'd worn for 3 years of this exact moment. The expression of a woman who had never once expected the math to come due. That expression was about to change. The credit alert had come in on a Tuesday, 6:47 a.m., while I was still in scrubs from a half marathon I hadn't run, just couldn't sleep and needed somewhere to put my hands besides a keyboard. The kitchen was cold the way it always is before the heater finishes its first cycle of the morning, and I remember the specific chill of the tile under my bare feet, the smell of yesterday's coffee still sitting in the pot I hadn't bothered to rinse, the blue glow of my phone screen, the only light in the room besides the gray haze of dawn coming through the blinds. I almost dismissed it. Soft inquiries throw up noise sometimes. Old accounts, clerical lag, a department store card I'd forgotten closing. I'd seen 100 false alarms in 14 years of doing this for other people, the kind of work where you learn quickly that not every flag is a fire. This wasn't noise. $148,000, a revolving line, opened 18 months ago, an address listed, that wasn't mine. A P.O. box 40 minutes from my house, in a town I had no reason to drive through. My hands didn't shake. That came later. In that first moment, something colder and more useful took over. The part of me that spent 14 years getting paid to not feel anything until the numbers are fully accounted for. I sat down at the kitchen table without deciding to, the chair cold against the back of my legs, phone still in my hand, scrolling through the same 3 lines of text again and again as if rereading them might change what they said. If you've ever opened something you weren't supposed to see and felt the whole room tilt sideways for a second, drop a comment. I want to know I'm not the only one who reaches for a spreadsheet before I reach for a phone. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call Beth. I called the credit bureau, requested the full file, and then I did the only thing that's ever made me feel steady. I opened a blank document and started a timeline. Dean found me at 1 a.m. 2 nights later, kitchen table covered in printouts, a yellow legal pad with dates running down the margin like tally marks. The overhead light buzzed faintly, the same flicker it's had since we moved in, something we kept meaning to fix and never quite got around to. The house was silent except for that buzz and the occasional creak of the floor settling, the specific quiet of a home where everyone else has been asleep for hours. "You should be asleep," he said, not as a complaint. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat without being asked, the way he does when he already knows the night's going to be long. He was still in the t-shirt he'd worn to bed, hair messy on one side, and he didn't ask for coffee, just sat there in the glow of my laptop screen and waited. "Look at this." I turned the laptop toward him. Account opened March of last year. First disbursement 11 days later, $4,200, routed to an account ending in 0091. Whose account is that? I didn't know yet. Took me a week to find out. It was Beth's landlord, a property management company in Hartwell Ridge. the complex she'd moved into right after she told everyone she'd found a better rate on her own. I kept pulling. 11 more disbursements over 14 months, same pattern, same rough amount, landing the same week rent was due. $62,000 total, almost to the dollar, sitting quietly under a loan with my name stamped on the origination page like a signature I'd never written. I remember staring at that origination signature for a long time that first night. The slight slant of it, close enough to mine that a careless eye might not catch the difference, far enough off that I knew, with absolute certainty, I had never put a pen to that page. The tuition took longer. Private school billing doesn't show up clean. It routes through a third-party tuition management platform, a layer of obfuscation that would have stopped someone who didn't do this for a living. I am, professionally, the person organizations hire, specifically because that kind of layer doesn't stop me. 3 days of cross-referencing invoice numbers against disbursement dates, working late into the night after Emma and Cora had gone to bed, the house quiet except for the hum of my laptop fan, working overtime, and there it was. $34,000, paid out across 6 semesters, for Aiden and Olivia's enrollment at a school whose tuition I had once heard my mother call, frankly, excessive for 9-year-olds. To my face, the same week she told me Emma and Cora's public school should be enough for them. I sat with that sentence for a long time. My phone buzzed at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Beth asking if I could spot her $200 for the kids' winter coats, just till payday. I sent it. I always send it. That night, I added the $200 to a running total that no longer felt like a favor between sisters. It felt like a line item in a budget I'd never agreed to be part of. I remember sitting there afterward, phone still in my hand, the screen dimming on its own from inactivity, doing the strange mental math of comparing the casual ease of that text, just till payday, against the 18 months of careful, deliberate fraud sitting in a folder 4 feet away. The contrast between the two felt almost unbearable, the casualness of one and the calculation of the other, both coming from the same family, the same house, the same people who had taught me everything I knew about right and wrong before apparently deciding none of it applied to me. The smell of the kitchen at that hour, burnt coffee from a pot I kept reheating, the specific staleness of a house gone quiet after midnight, is something I associate now with the exact moment I stopped being someone's daughter and started being someone's funding source. I want to be careful here, because this is the part people get wrong when they hear a story like mine. I didn't feel rage yet. Rage came later, and even then, it came in a small, controlled dose, the way it always does for me. What I felt at that kitchen table was something closer to recognition, the specific, grim satisfaction of watching a hypothesis you didn't want to be true get confirmed by the data anyway. The third category took the longest, because it was the one I didn't want to find. Christmas gifts. $28,000 across 2 holiday seasons, dispersed in November both years, routed through a third account that traced, after 4 more days of work, after I'd started keeping a folder labeled simply with a date instead of a name, because some things are easier to investigate when you don't let yourself feel them yet, to the exact retailer whose bags I'd watched my nephew and niece carry into my parents' living room last Christmas. The same bags, the same brand of wrapping paper, the kind with the gold foil trees that had been stacked under the tree while Emma and Cora's names went unread. I printed everything, 12 pages eventually, bank statements with relevant lines highlighted, a disbursement timeline I'd built in a spreadsheet, a side-by-side of dates that lined up too cleanly to be coincidence. I filed it the way I'd file evidence for a client, because some part of me had already decided, before I admitted it to myself, that this was no longer a family matter. It was a case. Dean read all 12 pages without saying a word. The kitchen light buzzed overhead while he turned each page slowly, his expression unreadable in the particular way it gets when he's working through something carefully, instead of reacting to it. When he finished, he set them down flat on the table, lined the edges up square, the way he straightens things when he's giving himself a second before he speaks. "They used your name," he said. "Not a question." "They used my name," I said, "to pay for the things they wouldn't give my kids." He didn't ask what I was going to do about it. He asked something better. "When?" I already knew. I'd known since the tuition invoices lined up with the disbursement dates, since I'd sat at this table and felt the specific click of a hypothesis closing into a fact. "Christmas," I said. "I want them all in the room." I filed the fraud report 2 weeks before the holiday, quietly through the bank's identity theft division, the same channel I'd have told any client to use. I opened an identity theft case with the FTC the same afternoon. I requested a fraud alert on every bureau, froze what needed freezing, and started the slow, procedural work of unwinding $148,000 of debt that had never been mine. None of it was dramatic. That's the part people don't expect from a story like this. There was no confrontation, no slammed door, no late-night phone call where I screamed at my mother until she cried. There was just a woman at a kitchen table, 2 months running, building a case file against her own parents the same way she'd build one against a stranger, because the moment I stopped looking for an explanation that made this forgivable, the work got easier. I bought a small red box the second week of December. No bow. I didn't want it to look like a gift because it wasn't one. I remember standing in the gift wrap aisle of a department store, surrounded by exactly the kind of festive paper my parents had used to wrap gifts paid for with my own stolen identity, feeling almost nothing as I chose the plainest box on the shelf, the least decorative one, deliberately at odds with everything around it. I wrapped 12 pages inside it instead, set them at the bottom, and didn't tell a single person outside my own house what was waiting under that paper. Beth texted me on the 23rd asking if I'd softened up about coming this year, since I'd been quiet. I told her we'd be there. I meant it. I just didn't tell her why. In the days leading up to Christmas Eve, I kept returning to a single detail that bothered me more than any of the dollar figures: the P.O. box. 40 minutes from my house, in a town I had no reason to visit, registered under a name I eventually traced back to a notary office my mother had used for years for small estate paperwork. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't even particularly well hidden, not for someone trained to look. It was simply assumed by whoever set it up that no one would ever look. That assumption, more than the dollar amount, was the part I couldn't stop turning over in my mind. They hadn't just taken my identity. They'd been confident enough in their own invisibility that they hadn't bothered to be careful about it. They had built an entire financial arrangement on the quiet certainty that I would never become the kind of person who checked. They had simply never accounted for the fact that checking is what I do for a living. Christmas Eve, 5:40 p.m. I stood in my parents' driveway for a full 90 seconds before going inside, the red box sitting in my tote bag like something with a pulse. The porch light was already on, the same yellow bulb my father's replaced 100 times over the years without ever upgrading to anything brighter, casting its familiar weak glow over the same welcome mat that's been there since I was in high school. Someone had hung a wreath on the door, fresh evergreen, the kind my mother orders from the same local nursery every year, because she says the artificial ones look cheap from the street. Dean had the girls' hands, one each, walking them up the salted path while I stayed back by the car a moment longer, doing the thing I do before any audit closes, running the numbers one last time, checking for an error that would mean I was wrong about all of it. The cold air bit at my face, sharper than I remembered it being earlier that afternoon, and I could see my breath fog faintly in front of me as I stood there, watching my family walk toward a door I'd walked through 1,000 times without ever once thinking it might be the last time it felt the same. The neighborhood was quiet, most houses already lit up for the night, a few scattered cars idling in driveways, while families made their own versions of this same walk toward their own front doors. There wasn't an error. There never had been. I'd checked the timeline against the disbursement dates 4 separate times over the past 2 months, cross-referenced every figure against bank statements and invoices, built spreadsheets I could have presented to a board of directors without a single number out of place. Whatever was about to happen inside that house, it wasn't going to happen because I'd gotten something wrong. Inside, the house was exactly what it always is at Christmas. Warm light, the smell of cinnamon from a candle. My mother burns every December and never any other month. A tree so heavily decorated, it looked staged for a catalog. 40 photographs on the corkboard by the kitchen. 42 now. I noticed 2 new ones of Aiden and Olivia at the school I'd just spent 2 months tracing $34,000 toward. Their school portraits framed in matching gold trim that probably cost more than the picture itself. I scanned the board quickly, almost without meaning to, the way you scan any familiar scene for what's changed since you last looked. Not a single photo of Emma or Cora had been added in 3 years. The same 2 pictures of them, taken when Emma was 5, had simply stayed pinned in the same corner, slightly faded now from the kitchen light, while the rest of the board filled in around them. I hugged my mother at the door. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part that still sits strangely with me. I hugged her, and it didn't feel like deception. It felt like the last beat of a routine I'd performed my whole life, running on muscle memory while the rest of me was already somewhere else, already past her. She smelled like the same perfume she's worn for 20 years, and for just a second, hugging her, I felt something soften that I immediately had to consciously push back into place. "You look thin," she said, the way she always does, the closest thing to affection she knows how to offer. "I'm fine, Mom." Beth arrived 20 minutes later with the twins, breathless from the cold, already laughing about something with our father before she'd even gotten her coat off. Roy lit up the way he does for her, easy, immediate, no calculation required. I used to wonder what that felt like. I'd stopped wondering somewhere around the $62,000 mark. I watched him take her coat for her, an old habit, the same small gesture of doting attention I couldn't remember him ever once extending to me, hanging it carefully on the hook by the door, reserved as far as I could remember, exclusively for Beth's coats over the years. For 2 hours, it was just Christmas. Coco. A board game Aiden won and announced too loudly, his small fist pumping in the air while Beth cheered from the couch. Cora curled into my side on the couch, watching her cousins the way she watches most things in this house. Carefully, from a slight distance, the way you watch something to learn its rules rather than to enjoy it. I kept my arm around her, feeling the small weight of her settle against me, and tried to memorize the shape of this particular kind of caution in a 5-year-old, the way she'd learned, without anyone teaching her directly, exactly how much warmth this house was willing to offer her, and how to ration her expectations accordingly. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who love you and still felt like you were doing math in your head instead of having a feeling, drop a comment. I think more people carry that than admit it. At 7:15, my mother stood, smoothing her cardigan, and reached for the paper. I'd known it was coming. I'd built an entire 2 months of my life around the certainty that it was coming. And still, something in my chest tightened when she unfolded it, the specific physical click of a hypothesis you'd hoped, despite everything, might not confirm itself a 3rd time. Some small, stubborn part of me, the part that still wanted to believe the math could come out differently this time, had to be consciously talked down. I noticed my own pulse in my throat, steady but quick, the body's honest reaction even when the mind has already finished its calculations. "The list," she said, "of grandchildren who deserve gifts this year." Emma's hand found mine without either of us deciding it should. I felt her pulse in her fingers, quick and small, and I squeezed back gently, trying to communicate something I couldn't say out loud yet. "Not much longer, I promise. Not much longer." She looked up at me once, just briefly. The same searching look she'd given me every year at this exact moment, checking my face for some sign of what to expect, the way children do when they've learned the adults around them are the only reliable forecast for how a room is about to feel. Aiden. Applause. Olivia. More applause. My father's loudest of all, like volume could stand in for the things he'd never said directly. He clapped with both hands raised slightly, a small performance of enthusiasm that landed, to me, as exactly that. A performance, rehearsed by repetition if not by intention, the muscle memory of 3 years doing the same thing in the same order. I watched my mother's eyes move down the page, watch them skip. Not pause, not hesitate, just skip, the way you skip a typo you've read so many times you no longer register it as a mistake, over the 2 names that should have come next. Her eyes didn't even slow down. That, more than anything else that night, was what stayed with me afterward. Not cruelty exactly, just the absolute smoothness of an exclusion practiced so many times it had stopped requiring any visible effort at all. She folded the paper. This was the moment, not the loan, not the disbursements, not the 12 pages sitting 4 feet away in my bag. This. A woman folding a piece of paper back into her pocket like she'd just finished a chore, while my daughter's hand went very still in mine. I have spent 14 years finding the exact point where a number stops being an abstraction and becomes a fact someone has to live with. I felt that point arrive in my own chest, clean and total, the way it always does in a case file the moment the last piece of corroborating evidence lands. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was simply final, the way a number is final once you've checked it 3 times and it still comes out the same. I wasn't her daughter in that room. I hadn't been for a long time. I was a recurring line item, a name on an account, a source of funds, something that existed to keep the actual family running smoothly while never appearing on the list of people the family ran for. Infrastructure doesn't get its name read. Infrastructure just has to keep working. I stopped looking at my mother's face for an explanation. I'd spent 34 years doing that, waiting for the version of events where this all made sense, where there was a reason good enough to explain why my daughter's names never made it off the page. There wasn't one. There had never been one. There was just $148,000 and a P.O. box 40 minutes from my house and a family that had quietly decided I was more useful as a resource than valuable as a person. My jaw had locked at some point without my noticing. I felt it now, the tightness running up into my temple, and I deliberately let it go. The way I've trained myself to release tension before walking into any room where I need my voice steady. I breathed once, slow, the kind of breath I use before delivering bad news to a client, the kind that costs nothing visible, but buys you exactly the steadiness you need for the next 60 seconds. Dean's hand found the small of my back. He didn't say anything. He'd stopped needing to, somewhere around page 9 of that file. I felt the warmth of his palm through my sweater, grounding in a way that had nothing to do with words, and I understood, in that moment, exactly why I'd married a man who knew when silence was more useful than speech. My mother turned toward the tree, already moving on, already reaching for the next gift to hand to a child whose name had been read. I let go of Emma's hand. "Actually," I said, and my voice came out quieter than I expected, almost gentle. "Before you keep going, I have something for the girls to give you." The room didn't go silent yet. Beth laughed, said something about hoping it wasn't more cocoa mix. My father glanced over, mildly curious, already half distracted by Olivia tugging his sleeve. The Christmas radio station kept playing faintly from the kitchen, the same 6 songs looping in the background, completely indifferent to what was about to unfold a few feet away from the speaker it was playing through. I reached into my bag. My hand closed around the red box, and for one full second, the last second before any of this became irreversible, I thought about every version of this family that had ever felt like enough. The version where my mother's hug at the door meant what it used to. The version where being needed and being loved weren't the same transaction. I let myself feel that loss completely, fully, for exactly 1 second, the way you let yourself feel grief before a procedure. You know you can't postpone any longer. I thought, briefly, about every Christmas before the exclusion started, the years when my name had still been read off, whatever list existed back then, when this house had felt, however imperfectly, like somewhere I belonged without having to earn it. I let that version go the way you let go of a number that will never balance, no matter how many times you rerun it. I stood up, box in hand, and walked toward the tree. Beth was still talking, oblivious, something about needing to grab another drink from the kitchen. My father had already turned his attention back to the twins. None of them had any idea yet that the quiet daughter standing at the edge of their tree was holding the only thing in this entire room that was actually going to matter by the time the night ended. The lights on the tree blinked in their slow, steady pattern, red and gold, reflecting faintly off the surface of the red box in my hands, the same colors almost, though nothing about what was inside it had anything to do with the holiday it was about to interrupt. I could feel my own heartbeat in my fingertips as I closed the last few feet of distance between myself and my mother. And somewhere behind me, I heard Dean shift his weight slightly, the small sound of him preparing to stand if I needed him to, though I already knew, with the same certainty I bring to any closed case file, that I wouldn't. This was mine to finish. I crossed the living room slower than I needed to, the box steady in both hands, and I watched my mother's expression shift from mild confusion to the particular brightness she reserves for receiving things. The tree lights blinked behind her, red and gold catching the edge of her cardigan, and for a half second she looked exactly like she had every other Christmas of my life, pleased, composed, fully certain of her place at the center of the room. Somewhere behind me, I heard Beth shift on the couch, the soft creak of cushions, and I was aware, peripherally, of every small sound in that room, the way you're aware of background noise, right before something important happens. The radio in the kitchen, the faint crackle of the fireplace, my father's chair creaking slightly as he leaned forward to watch. "For me?" she said, already smiling, already reaching. "From the girls," I said. "Open it." She peeled the lid back the way she opens everything, efficiently, expecting something nice. Her fingers found paper instead of tissue, and I watched the smile hold for one more second before it caught up with what her hands were already telling her. I could see the exact moment her brain registered that the texture under her fingers wasn't wrapping paper or ribbon, but something flatter, heavier, official in a way that didn't belong inside a Christmas box at all. Her thumb paused on the edge of the first page, and for just a moment, she looked almost like she might close the box again without reading further, as if some instinct deep enough to bypass curiosity was warning her what was coming. She didn't close it. 12 pages. No bow, no card, nothing that looked like Christmas. The room had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the comfortable quiet of people opening gifts, but the specific stillness of people realizing a script has changed and nobody handed them the new lines. Even the radio in the kitchen seemed distant suddenly, its cheerful instrumental loop completely out of step with whatever was unfolding around the tree. My mother's eyes dropped to the first line. Account opened in the name of Leah Greer, $148,000. Her face didn't drain all at once. It went in stages, the color leaving the way water leaves a basin, slow at first and then all at once. Her hands, the same hands that had folded that, list so neatly 20 minutes earlier, started to shake hard enough that the pages rattled. A small, papery sound that seemed enormous in the sudden silence of the room. "Mom?" Beth said, half laughing, the way people laugh when they're hoping the discomfort in a room is a misunderstanding instead of a fact. "What is it?" I didn't wait for my mother to find words. I'd given her 2 months without an explanation. She didn't get a third audience with one now. $62,000, I said, went to Beth's rent. $34,000 went to Aiden and Olivia's tuition. $28,000 paid for Christmas gifts, the ones under that tree, the ones my daughters have never been on the list to receive. My voice didn't rise. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect this part to be shouted, and it wasn't. 14 years of finding the exact sentence that makes a number undeniable had taught me that volume isn't what makes a fact land. Precision is. I kept my hands at my sides, steady, the same posture I use closing out an audit when a client needs to hear something difficult without also having to manage my emotions on top of their own. That's not... My mother started. We were going to... Laya, it wasn't supposed to. The reason my daughters aren't on your list, I said, is because everything on that list was paid for using my name. My father stood up from the recliner for the first time all night, mouth open, no sound coming out yet. Roy Hale, 66 years old, who had spent 2 decades choosing silence over difficulty, finally had nothing left to be silent about and didn't know what to do with that. His mug sat forgotten on the armrest, a thin curl of steam still rising from it, the most ordinary detail in a room that had just stopped being ordinary at all. That's not, my mother started. We were going to pay it back, Leia. We just needed... I let that sit in the room the way I let a final number sit in front of a client. No further argument needed, no embellishment required. The math did what math does. It simply was what it was, and no amount of we were going to pay it back changed a single digit of it. Beth had gone white, looking between her mother and the pages, putting together, visibly, in real time, exactly how many of the last 18 months of her life had been funded by a fraud she may or may not have known about. I didn't ask which. That investigation, if she wanted it answered for her own conscience, wasn't mine to run. Aiden had gone quiet beside her, sensing without understanding, the way children sense weather before anyone names the storm. If you've ever watched a room full of relatives do the math in real time, faces changing one by one as the numbers finally land, drop a comment. I think there's nothing quite like watching a story collapse exactly as fast as it deserves to. I've already filed a fraud report, I said. I've opened an identity theft case. The bank's investigation started 2 weeks ago, and it doesn't stop because tonight got uncomfortable. My mother's hands hadn't stopped shaking. Laya, please, we can talk about this. We are talking about it, I said. The debt isn't mine anymore. It's yours now. Nobody clapped. Nobody read another name off any list. The 42 photographs on the corkboard kept smiling the same way they had an hour earlier, oblivious to the fact that the room underneath them had just permanently rearranged itself. I glanced at that corkboard for just a second, at the 2 faded pictures of Emma and Cora tucked in the corner, the same 2 pictures that had never been updated in 3 years, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with the fraud at all. My father finally spoke, his voice rough, smaller than I'd ever heard it. Laya, we didn't mean for it to go this far. You meant for every part of it, I said, not unkindly, just factually. You meant to open the account. You meant to route the payments. You meant to read that list every Christmas for 3 years and skip my daughters' names every single time. Nothing about tonight was an accident except getting caught. He didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that would have survived the room. I didn't stay to watch the rest of it unfold. The denial, the blame that started landing in every direction except where it belonged. My mother's voice rising into something between an apology and an accusation. I'd built this case the way I build every case, to stand on its own, without needing me in the room to defend it. I walked into the kitchen instead. Emma and Cora's handmade reindeer cards were still sitting on the counter where I'd set them down hours earlier, glitter glue not quite dry. 2 names written in 8-year-old and 5-year-old handwriting on envelopes that had never once, in 3 Christmases, made it onto any list that mattered in this house. I picked them up carefully, mindful of the glue, the small weight of construction paper and crayon feeling, in that moment, like the only thing in the entire house that had any honest value left in it. The radio was still playing on the counter, the same loop it had been running all evening, oblivious to everything happening just one room away, and I reached over and turned it off, the silence that followed feeling oddly appropriate, the kind of quiet a house earns after something true has finally been said in it. Dean was already at the door with the girls' coats, Emma watching me with the careful, searching look she gives any room she's not sure is safe yet, Cora half asleep against his shoulder, unaware that anything in her grandmother's house had changed tonight at all. I took Emma's coat from him and helped her into it myself, my hands steadier now than they'd been at any point in the last 2 months, the strange calm that comes after a thing you've been bracing for finally, completely happens. Emma looked up at me as I zipped her coat, her eyes still carrying that same searching quality, and I gave her the smallest, most honest smile I had left in me. Not happiness exactly, just relief, the kind that comes after setting something down you've been carrying far too long. "Are we going home now?" she asked quietly. "Yes, baby," I said. "We're going home." I took my husband's hand. We left. Behind us, I could still hear my mother's voice, thinner now, asking questions that had no good answers left to give. I didn't turn back. The cold air outside hit my face the same way it had walking in, sharp and clean, and for the first time in 3 Christmases, walking away from that house felt like exactly the right direction to be moving. The porch light caught the edges of the wreath on the door one last time as we walked past it, and I remember thinking, almost absently, that it was the last Christmas wreath from that house I'd ever need to notice again. The drive home was quiet, the girls asleep in the back within minutes, the heater humming low, Dean's hand resting briefly on my knee at a red light without either of us saying anything about why. Some moments don't need narration. That drive was one of them. The bank's investigation closed 3 weeks into January. The fraud was confirmed in full. The account, the disbursements, the forged signature on the original application. The $148,000 was formally reassigned, removed from my name and my credit entirely, the debt landing where it had always actually belonged. I remember the phone call from the fraud department, the specific relief of hearing a stranger's voice confirm, in flat procedural language, every single thing I'd already proven myself 2 months earlier at my own kitchen table. My credit recovered within a month. Beth's financial support didn't. Without the loan quietly covering her rent, she had to give up the apartment in Hartwell Ridge by spring, moving into a smaller place across town that she never once mentioned to me directly. I only knew because Dean's cousin lived in the same complex and happened to recognize her moving boxes. The twins changed schools in the fall, the private tuition no longer something anyone in the family could justify or afford. I felt no satisfaction in that part, only the flat, settled certainty that consequences, once allowed to land, tend to land exactly where the original choices were made. My parents didn't call for a long time. When my mother finally did, it wasn't an apology. Not really. It was an explanation, the kind that circles a fact without ever touching it directly, the kind of careful non-admission I'd heard from her my entire life and finally recognized clearly for what it was. She talked about difficult years and trying their best and never intending for things to spiral, and I let her finish every sentence without interrupting. The same patience I extend to any client trying to explain away a number that doesn't actually need explaining, because the number speaks for itself regardless of what story gets layered on top of it. I listened. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to investigate. My father never called at all. I think, in some way, that silence said more honestly what he felt than any phone call from my mother ever could have. Not remorse exactly, just the quiet recognition of a man who had run out of stories worth telling. Emma still draws pictures sometimes, not of her grandmother's house anymore, just our kitchen, our tree, 4 stick figures, and a dog we don't even have yet, all of them holding hands, all of them in her careful 8-year-old crayon strokes, smiling at each other instead of at some list none of them had to earn their way onto. I keep one taped to my office wall, right above my desk, where I see it every single day I sit down to work. A small, permanent reminder of exactly what all those late nights at the kitchen table had actually been for. I kept the 12 pages, eventually, filed away in the same cabinet where I keep every closed case. Not because I needed them anymore, but because some part of me still believes in keeping a record of things that were once true and almost got away with staying hidden. Some nights, when the house is quiet and Dean's already asleep, I think about that cabinet, about the folder sitting in it, and feel something I can only describe as a strange, settled peace. Not triumph, nothing as loud as triumph, just the simple knowledge that the truth had finally been allowed to exist in the open instead of staying buried under 30 years of careful family performance. Theo, Beth's youngest, the one too small that Christmas to understand any of it, asked me once, years later, what had actually happened that night. I told him the truth, the simple version, the one that didn't need exaggeration to land, that some debts get paid in dollars and some get paid in attention. And our family had spent years pretending the second kind didn't count as long as nobody added it up. He didn't fully understand yet. I think, someday, he will. A child should never have to earn love, and neither should you.